I have to admit, when I first arrived in the Philippines, I was blown away by how warm, welcoming, and chaotic everything was. But nothing, prepared me for the phenomenon of the good plate. Yes, the good plate. I thought I understood Filipino hospitality: smiling faces, endless food, people hovering over you with forks like I might forget how to eat. But the good plate? That was next level. It was sitting there in the cabinet, gleaming like a trophy under the fluorescent light in a slightly awkward plastic display case. It was one of those ceramic plates with gold trim and floral patterns that looked like it belonged in a museum. I remember thinking, who is going to use this? Surely someone will eat off this. And then my host, Maria, the sweetest woman in the world, said it. That plate is for guests. I nodded politely because I'm American and I was trying to be respectful. But I didn't really understand. I mean, we had guests, yes, but why not just use a regular plate? Maria smiled, her eyes twinkling. You see, sometimes guests never come. I laughed, assuming it was a joke. But when I saw the plate the next morning, still gleaming, untouched, I realized this was serious. The plate sat there for weeks, months, sometimes even years. I started to notice a pattern. Every time a guest was supposedly coming, the good plate would be taken out, polished, ceremoniously placed on the table, and then nothing. No guest. Just us, staring awkwardly at the plate. I began asking questions, trying to understand the psychology behind it. Why not just eat off it since no one is coming? Maria looked at me as if I had committed a crime against the universe. It's respect. You must save it for the one who might arrive. And then, in a tone that was both serious and mystical, she added, even if they don't. It was so Filipino. There was this unspoken understanding that the plate symbolized hope, patience, and a slight obsession with appearances. I later learned that families sometimes own several good plates, each reserved for different types of guests. The family friend who visits once a year, the distant relative who might arrive during Christmas but never does, and the neighbor who once borrowed sugar and now must be honored with a ceremonial dish if they step inside. I was living in a household with at least 5, maybe, plates. One morning, curiosity got the better of me. I took the smallest, prettiest fork and dared to scoop a piece of leftover rice from the good plate. I immediately felt guilty, like I had accidentally committed sacrilege. Maria appeared in the doorway, hands on her hips, staring at me with the kind of disappointment that would make a nun cry. You ate from the good plate? She asked. I stammered, trying to explain that I thought no one was coming. Maria shook her head solemnly. No one has arrived, yes, but what if they do? And there it was again, the Filipino logic that I would spend years trying to decode. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but the possibility is sacred. It wasn't about pragmatism. It was about hope, ritual, and the unshakable belief that a guest deserves more than just a regular plate, even if that guest only exists in theory. Over the next few weeks, I began observing my Filipino neighbors. Every household seemed to have its own version of the good plate. Some were ceramic, some were fine china, others were simple glass plates but treated with the same reverence. The ritual was the same everywhere. It's cleaned meticulously, polished until it gleams, wrapped in a napkin sometimes, and stored on a shelf that no one dares touch. I noticed children peeking at it occasionally, wondering when it might finally be used. Parents would scold them with, "Do not touch, that is sacred," and the kids would immediately back away, wide-eyed. It was fascinating. I had seen Americans have special things, the silverware set only for holidays, the couch reserved for guests. But nothing approached this level of symbolic obsession. The good plate wasn't about function. It was about identity, status, and the intangible feeling that your family's hospitality is not trivial. It was a silent promise. If someone important shows up, we honor them. And if no one shows up, we still honor the idea of hospitality. One day, a distant cousin supposedly visited. I say supposedly because in the end, I never saw him. Maria prepared the good plate with the finest pancit, topped with a little extra fried garlic as a gesture of love. The rice was fluffed perfectly, and the lumpia arranged like it was about to enter a beauty pageant. I watched in awe, because here I was, an outsider, and yet I felt the weight of the ritual. Every sprinkle of seasoning seemed sacred, every napkin fold a silent prayer for the cousin who might arrive. Hours passed. We waited, and then the neighbor's dog barked. That was it. No cousin, no announcement, no car pulling up. Maria sighed, removed the good plate, and placed it back on the shelf. I felt a pang of sadness for the imaginary guest. I even considered taking a selfie with it, captioning, "Me, alone with Filipino culture." But that seemed disrespectful. I realized then that the good plate is also about resilience. Filipinos seem to thrive on expectation and disappointment simultaneously. They prepare, they hope, they decorate, they arrange, and they wait. And if nothing happens, they carry on. The good plate represents this uncanny ability to plan for someone who might never arrive, and somehow, to do so joyfully, with grace, and with extreme attention to detail. It got me thinking about the other aspects of Filipino life I had witnessed. The ritual of putting out food for visitors, even when the house is empty. The cheerful mabuhay, greeting for every delivery person. The tradition of keeping extra chairs at the dining table just in case. The tiny bags of snacks ready for friends who drop by without warning. Everything seemed tied to hope, preparation, and a polite insistence that your best effort should always be visible, even if it goes unappreciated. Later that week, I asked Maria what would happen if a real, actual guest arrived. She laughed in a way that made me realize I had missed the punchline of the universe. "They'll be thrilled," she said, "but maybe a little suspicious. They might wonder why the plate looks so untouched, like it's been waiting for them for years. And maybe it has." The good plate was more than a dish. It was a story, a legacy, and a secret between the household and the universe. It taught me something about patience, about ritual, about hope. Even in chaos, even in small disappointments, even in daily life where floods, traffic, and power outages dominate, the good plate remained untouchable, a shining symbol of Filipino resilience and their very particular brand of hospitality. I began to notice other rituals connected to it. The careful selection of what goes on the plate, the gentle polishing of cutlery, the slight nod of approval from elders whenever someone admired the plate. Sometimes Maria would even place a tiny garnish on the edge, just to remind me that perfection was temporary, fleeting, and yet worth striving for. I tried to explain this to my friends back home. "Yes, it's just a plate," I said. "But it's not. It's about symbolism, honor, and, also, a little bit of patience training." They laughed, but I could tell they didn't fully understand. They wouldn't. You can read about Filipino culture in books or watch travel shows, but the good plate? That's an experience you live. It's the kind of tradition that is quietly respected, subtly enforced, and sometimes a little absurd. Weeks turned into months. I stopped asking about the plate. I didn't touch it, didn't comment on it, didn't even stare too long. I just let it exist in the corner of the kitchen, gleaming under the fluorescent light, waiting for someone who might never arrive. And every time I glanced at it, I couldn't help but smile. Somehow, I had come to understand the Filipino perspective. The joy isn't in receiving. The joy is in preparing, in hoping, in showing respect for the idea of a guest, even if that guest is imaginary. And maybe, I thought, that's why Filipinos are so happy despite everything. They prepare for life, hope for life, and sometimes, they never even need the reason they prepared. They just live joyfully in the meantime, with all their good plates polished and ready, with a little chaos swirling around them, and with laughter echoing through the kitchen. By the end of the month, I had become a kind of honorary guardian of the good plate. I even caught myself occasionally whispering, "Don't worry, I won't eat you," when no one was watching. I wasn't sure if this was respect or insanity, but in the Philippines, the line is always blurry, and I liked it that way. And then one evening, Maria made me sit down with her, tea in hand, and said seriously, "One day, you might understand why we keep it." I nodded, pretending I did, though I knew it would take years. The good plate isn't just a plate. It's a philosophy, a discipline, a celebration of possibility. And maybe, just maybe, a little rebellion against a world that insists everything must have immediate use. As I left that evening, the plate glimmered in the fading sunlight. I smiled. I understood in my own way the quiet, enduring, slightly hilarious magic of the good plate. for guests that never arrive, for hope that never dies, and for the kind of cultural absurdity you can only find in the Philippines. After living in the Philippines for a few months, I started noticing that the good plate had a mysterious gravitational pull. It wasn't just a dish, it was the center of a tiny universe of Filipino rituals that I had yet to fully understand. Every household I visited had one, sometimes two, sometimes a whole collection that was never, ever used. And yet it held power over everyone in the room. One afternoon, I attended a small birthday gathering at Maria's cousin's house. The good plate was prominently displayed on the dining table, surrounded by bowls of pancit, fried chicken, and lumpia. I asked innocently, "Are we really not going to use it?" The adults exchanged glances and nodded solemnly. I didn't get it yet. The children, on the other hand, were giving it side-eye, whispering, "Who even eats off that thing?" I decided to observe. Every so often, someone would pretend to reach for it, then quickly retract their hand as if it might explode. I realized the good plate functioned not just as a ceremonial object, but as a subtle form of social control. It reminded everyone to respect hierarchy, tradition, and invisible rules that I, as a foreigner, could barely grasp. Later, the party's music kicked in, karaoke naturally, and someone suggested using the good plate as a makeshift prop for balancing snacks while moving from the table to the sofa. The elders gasped. "No, don't touch it!" Maria's uncle shouted. I wanted to laugh, but the reverence in his tone made it impossible. This wasn't about practicality. This was about honor, about legacy, about maintaining the fragile illusion that Filipino hospitality always had its ceremonial peak intact. I started noticing a pattern. The good plate was involved in nearly every special occasion: birthdays, baptisms, weddings, fiestas, even the occasional bar mitzvah-level celebration for a distant cousin who only visited once a year. And yet, the plate itself remained pristine. My theory? The good plate exists not for guests, but as a constant reminder to everyone else that the family knows how to prepare for life's unexpected arrivals: guests, blessings, disasters, or even government inspections. It was a talisman, a trophy, and a tiny source of domestic tension rolled into one. One day, a neighbor named Liza invited me over for a simple lunch. I assumed naturally that the food would be served on regular plates. But then, the good plate emerged. Liza placed it on the table, and my heart skipped a beat. "Are we really?" I began. She smiled serenely and shook her head. No, just for display. Guests might come." I laughed, nervously, because I still didn't fully understand the rules. What exactly constitutes a guest? And what if they never arrive? It turned out that Liza had a rule even more complex than Maria's. The good plate could only be used if 3 conditions were met. 1, the guest must be formally announced at least 24 hours in advance. 2, the guest must be considered worthy by all elders present. 3, and most importantly, the plate must return to its designated spot immediately after use. Failure to follow these rules, Liza warned me, could cause spiritual imbalance, though I suspected it was more about family pride. I started paying attention to small details. The good plate was often accompanied by a secondary set of ceremonial utensils, hand towels folded like origami, and sometimes even a tiny decorative item, like a miniature parole or a plastic fruit. Every single item was arranged in a precise formation, as if a tiny army of invisible etiquette officers were inspecting it constantly. And the children? They learned quickly. One wrong move, one accidental touch, and the entire household would collectively sigh, like the plate had silently shamed them. During one visit to a bustling barangay fiesta, I witnessed an astonishing event. The good plate, traveling through a parade of hands, carried atop a pillow, protected by siblings, cousins, and a neighbor, with an unusually serious expression. I asked why. They explained proudly that it was a symbolic gesture to show respect to a distant relative who had moved abroad and would be attending dinner that evening. I watched as they placed it on the dining table, polished it, and then the guest never arrived. Apparently, there had been a last-minute delay. I laughed nervously, realizing that this was the standard operating procedure for good plates, expect the unexpected, and prepare meticulously, regardless of outcome. By now, I had developed a mental catalog of good plate types. There was the single use for an absent guest plate, the fiesta centerpiece plate, the wedding emergency plate, and my personal favorite, the maybe someday someone important will visit plate. Each had its own personality, its own story, and its own set of rules that could not be broken without serious social consequences. I began experimenting with subtle rebellion, small acts of curiosity. One afternoon, I put a tiny piece of banana on a good plate just to see what would happen. Maria noticed immediately. She gave me the look. It was a mixture of horror, disappointment, and amusement. "You know better," she said. I laughed nervously, because I did know better. That plate was untouchable. And yet the audacity of putting even one bite on it made me feel like a kind of domestic daredevil. Weeks passed, and I realized that the good plate was also a barometer for Filipino creativity under constraint. Families would decorate it for holidays, display it during special occasions, and occasionally even use it as a platform for community storytelling. During Christmas, they would arrange small lights around it. During New Year, tiny coins. The plate became a stage for ritualized performance, a testament to human ingenuity, and a small, quiet rebellion against the mundane. I started documenting my experiences. I took careful notes, photographs, discreetly of course, and even started sketching diagrams showing the typical life cycle of a good plate: storage, polishing, ceremonial use, and eventual return to the shelf. Each step had its own timing, its own etiquette, and its own set of subtle social signals that I would never have guessed existed. One particularly memorable day, a very distant relative of Maria arrived unexpectedly. Everyone panicked. The good plate had been stored for months, completely polished and ready. There was a frenzy of activity. The table was rearranged, napkins folded, utensils inspected, and the food was carefully portioned. The cousin looked around, impressed, but ultimately oblivious to the decades-long ritual that had prepared the plate for their arrival. I watched in amazement as the ceremony unfolded. The good plate fulfilled its destiny. And when the cousin left, everyone sighed, relieved, and returned the plate to its sacred spot. I realized that in the Filipino household, the guest might come and go, but the ritual, the preparation, and the symbolism of the good plate endure indefinitely. By now, I had internalized the unwritten rules. I stopped touching the plate. I refrained from commenting on it. I treated it with a kind of reverent amusement that was half awe, half confusion. And yet, every time I saw a gleam of sunlight reflecting off the carefully polished surface, I couldn't help but smile. It was absurd, it was beautiful, and it was utterly, unmistakably Filipino. Even in moments of chaos, during power outages, thunderstorms, or family arguments, the good plate remained untouchable, impervious to the mundane trials of life. It was a constant, a symbol of the Filipino approach to existence. Prepare meticulously, hope optimistically, and carry on joyfully, whether anyone shows up or not. Eventually, I realized that the good plate had taught me a deeper lesson about Filipino culture. It wasn't just about dishes. It was about resilience, hope, patience, and the quiet strength of traditions that seem illogical to outsiders, but make perfect sense to those who live by them. And somewhere, in the gleaming ceramic, gold-trimmed edges, and floral patterns, I could see the heart of a nation that finds joy in preparation, even when the payoff never comes. By the end of my second year, I had become fully immersed. I could recognize the subtle differences between a guest who might arrive plate and a festival emergency plate at a glance. I knew the correct way to polish it, the proper hand signals for moving it, and even the right tone of voice to use when referencing it. It was, in a strange way, my initiation into Filipino domestic life. And still, the best part was watching the children. They approached the good plate with a combination of awe and mischief, understanding its rules instinctively, while always testing boundaries. It was a subtle, ongoing performance of respect, curiosity, and adaptation. And as I observed, I couldn't help but laugh at the quiet absurdity of it all. In a world that often felt chaotic, unpredictable, and nonsensical, the good plate was the perfect symbol of order, patience, and humor. By the time I left the Philippines for a brief trip abroad, I felt a twinge of longing. I knew the good plate would be there, gleaming, waiting for a guest who might never arrive. And I knew I would miss the lessons it silently taught: to prepare, to hope, to respect, and most importantly, to laugh at life's absurdities. The good plate had become more than a cultural curiosity. It had become a teacher, a mirror, and a constant reminder of the joyful resilience, creativity, and heart of the Filipino people. And in that realization, I found something remarkable. Sometimes the best parts of culture aren't the ones you touch, but the ones you witness, admire, and carry with you. And so, the good plate waits, untouchable, gleaming, forever prepared for guests that may never come, and for the hope, humor, and hospitality that define the Filipino spirit.